I didn't have time, so I just brought a few things along. And I thought what we could do is, instead of talking about a list of books, we could talk a little bit about the 5 ideas that define the history of storytelling. Okay? And the first of them is a very simple but inescapable fact. Storytelling is what you need for your brain. When most of us think about storytelling, you think about being read to from a book. The way my mother used to tell us stories, for example, was when I was about 2 or 3 years old. We had different curtains in our house, and they had different patterns on them. And every night my mother would come in and she'd look at the patterns, and whatever they were, she would make up a story, which is one of the oldest ways in which stories have traveled across the world, from grandmothers and mothers chiefly, but these days increasingly from fathers as well, down to their children. And it starts with something as simple as this. Once there was a kingdom of birds, and a kingdom where birds ruled the skies and the earth, until the day when the snakes decided to leave the rivers and leave their lairs and come out and have a great war. What we think we are doing when we listen to a story or when we open up a book is we think that we are working on the language area of our brains, Broca's area. But that's only part of it. It starts with Broca's area, and then as we're listening to this story, your mother says, and the birds flapped their wings, and they came down from the skies, looking to see what the cobras were doing. And something lights up in your sensory cortex. You start visualizing, you start smelling. You can see the river mud on the cobras. You can see the water glistening on their scales. The next thing that happens is that as the storyteller speaks and goes on, your mirror neurons begin to light up. Your mother says, and then the leader of the birds came down too fast, and he slammed right into a great tree, and you're like, And that is what the heart of storytelling historically has been about. It's been about switching on empathy, and it's just evolution's very cunning way of getting us to share experiences. It's a con job, but it's a con job without which we would probably be dead. When you come to the first written story ever, that teaches us a different lesson, and that lesson is something on the lines of what it means to be human. This is an epic from Mesopotamia called the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it was inscribed on tablets, but it was first an oral story. Now Gilgamesh is the classic, saga. It's the boy's story with a lot of wars. Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu go off and they get into battles and they meet gods, and all kinds of blood and gore and action happens. But the way the story starts is different. Enkidu, when we meet him, is not civilized. Instead, Enkidu is a man who walks with the birds and the animals. His hair is long and matted. He doesn't wear clothes. He goes barefoot. And because he's so comfortable with the animals, he sleeps with the gazelles, he talks to the wolves, the lions are his friends. He's messing up life for the rest of the hunters. So what they do is they call in reinforcements. And the first woman in the history of written story is Samhat. And this steps away a little bit from a tradition of polite women, but Samhat is officially a harlot. That's what she does by trade. And her mission is to get Enkidu away from the animals. So what she does is, for 6 days and 7 nights, she and Enkidu are together. And they make love. And Samhat is described in the epic as unrestrained. On the 7th day, Enkidu gets up. And he goes and he has a haircut. He oils his body. He puts on clothes. And he walks out towards his animals, and the gazelles run away from him. The wolves howl. The lions growl to warn everybody that a man is walking here. And Enkidu looks down at himself, and everything has changed because now he knows what his true nature is. So that's what happens at the start of the first story ever that was considered important enough to be written down. In order for man to discover, or human beings to discover who they were, they had to find a way to separate themselves from the animals. And part of this story is sad, because Enkidu goes from being a friend of the animals to being the man who stands on the border between human beings and animals. Because he knows the lions and the wolves so well, he has the job of guarding men. He fights the wolves, he kills the lions, and he goes off and he has great adventures. The third thing that we learned from the history of stories, once we had finished actually learning empathy, once we had finished looking at ourselves as human beings and claiming our humanity, the third thing that we learned was to look up and to look outwards. The next great cycles of stories, there's one line of stories that I think of as question stories, where you imagine men and women sitting there and looking up into the skies and saying, all right, there's the stars, there's the sun, we've been civilized to the extent where we can think about these things, and where did all of that come from, Who created this? How old is time? How far back does the universe go? And the greatest list of questions is collected in this little book that we know as the Vedas. Those stories, the question stories, are the source of most of our religious texts. It was actually people just going in answer to those things that created most of the great texts. They're all books that answer the question, why? What else is out there? The other set of questions that we asked, though, was captured to some extent in every cycle of fairy tales ever written. And that's what happens when you're looking out into the darkness that's closer, much closer than the skies. You're looking into the forests, you're looking into the trees. When the brothers Grimm sat down to collect the enormous set of fairy tales that were known as the Grimm's fairy tales and that have influenced everything from Disney films onwards, what they did was they sat down with the women who lived in the black forests and the villages, Dorothea Wilde and her colleagues, old women, middle-aged women who were by and large walking libraries. And what they discovered was part of every fairy tale is rooted in reality. If you've ever wondered about those awful creatures, the wicked, punishing, bullying stepmothers who walk through the Grimm's fairy tales, guess what? It was a period of high mortality for women who had children. They tended to die a lot in childbed. Sometimes the child would survive, the man would go out, marry again. It was the time also of relative famine and scarce resources. So that's your context for some of the world's oldest fairy tales, for some of the darkest stories ever. When they looked out into those fairy tales, what you see is very dark things. The woods are filled with evil creatures. There are monsters everywhere you look. There are wolves sometimes literally at the door. You cannot trust the old woman who lives in the wood with the beautiful house. And how do you survive this? You don't survive this entirely through cunning and resourcefulness. You also survive this through the other thing that we seem to consider essential. We can't do without magic, It's there in every tradition, and in the Grimm's fairy tales, it comes up with, for some reason, in order to survive our lives, we need the elves who make the shoes, we need the boys who turn into swans. We need something that goes a little beyond the everyday. My second last idea, I have two ideas left for you. And the second last one has to do again with the why do we need stories. This time we're going to travel a little bit and we're going to move towards Arabia. And there's a woman called Scheherazade who explains to us why we need stories to stay alive. The Arabian Nights started because of her husband, Shahryar. Shahryar's wife was unfaithful to him with apparently a very large and varied sequence of people. There was a cook, there was a black soldier. This varies a lot, but basically he got really upset about this. And being a king and not a normal human being, what he decided to do after chopping off her head was to marry a lot. In fact, he spent the next 3 years marrying virgins and maidens in the kingdom, sleeping with them at night after a sumptuous marriage feast and wedding ceremony, and executing them in the morning. I have to say that this did make me wonder about romance, how many women feel really happy about their wedding nights when they know that at some point of time they're going to come out of it. But I suppose Shahryar also got used to imagining his brides headless. And then Scheherazade, the vizier's daughter, when she realizes that she's one of the last ones left, and also that this cannot continue, the kingdom will drain of its women, she says, never mind, I'll go in. And she sits down with the king, who's, just going through the motions by now. He knows what the drill is. You get married, there's the wife, next morning, execution, guillotine, axe, whatever it is, And she says, look, this is going to happen anyway, and these are unpleasant things to think about. So why don't I tell you a story? And Shahryar, who by this time is probably bored by the lack of conversation in his many marriages, says, that seems like a good idea. Why don't you start? So Scheherazade does. And when she comes to dawn, she hasn't finished the story. And Shahryar says, wait a minute, she says, what a pity, you're going to have to execute me, so you'll never know the end, too bad. And he's like, okay, one night is fine. And the next day she starts up all over again. And then she creates a story within a story. There's a jinn, but there's also a seafarer. And the seafarer meets a rock, and his boat capsizes, and somebody on an island tells him another story, and oops, it's dawn. Blade about to come down, Shahryar's like, okay, fine, one more night, that's it, last offer. And this goes on for 1,001 nights. And here's the thing, in this collection of stories told by Scheherazade, she's putting them together from Persia, she's putting them together from Syria, from her imagination. This is one of the finest collections ever. But it's not entirely the beauty of these stories that saves her life. What saves her life is the other part of storytelling. What she senses about Shahryar is that he's lonely. You cannot execute 300 wives and not be a very lonely man. And somewhere she finds a way, just by sitting on his bed, bearing his children, by the way, in the middle of these 3 years before she's reprieved. But she's sitting on his bed, telling him one story after another until finally something like trust grows. Okay. The last idea I have for you is another one that's run throughout the history of stories. And it's the idea of anonymous. Nobody really knows how many of our stories were written by anonymous people. Just before I left the house, I printed some of my favorite first lines from story on this side of the page and a couple of anonymous poems out here. Virginia Woolf thought that anonymous must be a woman, because anonymous is everywhere. If you think about it, in India, you hear her voice when you go to a marriage and there's bridal songs being sung. If you step into rural India, every time there's a harvest, every time there's a woman pounding grain somewhere, what she's singing usually, or even if she's driving a tractor, which a lot of women do these days, it's something on the lines of, well, don't tell anybody I've hidden this bunch of paddy from my mother-in-law because she doesn't feed me anyway, stupid woman, and my brother hasn't come to get me for years, and I'm really sad and lonely, so I'm going to put it all in song, and guess what, I'm not going to sign my name, so there. And every culture has this tradition of women's songs celebrating the small things, births, marriages, festivals, sorrows, quiet tragedies, things that they can never quite say. I think a lot of anonymous stories are also written by men, written by things that they would either have been censured for or things that they didn't feel entirely free to say, and at different points of history, they were things that might have been too dangerous to say. So the conventional view of anonymous storytelling is that nobody signed their names because they didn't dare. And the more I look at the history of story and how long we've been telling stories to each other, the more I think that maybe there is actually another explanation. Maybe the people who were anonymous through history, maybe they just loved the idea of telling stories. Maybe they loved that idea more than they were in love with the idea of signing their names to it. Maybe they thought that what was really important, the way your mothers do when they're telling you stories, or anyone who's an adult does when they're picking up a kid and just telling that child a bedtime story. Maybe what they thought was important was that you have to find the right story, okay? And you have to make it something that will last and breathe a little life into it and then sail it off. Let it land wherever it will. And you have to trust that the people who find that story are going to be people who will take it forward, who will find a home for it and a place for it. And at some point of time, I think throughout the history of human storytelling, humans just being humanity, I think what we've learned to cherish is the idea that you don't always have to own the story, you know. You don't have to put your name on it and you don't have to sign off on it. What's really important is just let it go and share it. Thank you.